Welcome everyone to this presentation called Grief and Loss, Considerations During a Pandemic. My name is Kim Pangrass and I'm a family counselor with the Grief Support Program, affiliated with Alberta Health Services. We are coming to you from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. With me is my colleague, Katie Hatch, a family counselor also with the program.
Hello, everyone. We are so glad you're able to join us for this information session. Many of you may be here because you have lost a loved one recently. Perhaps your loss was some time ago. Some of you may want to know how to support someone who is grieving and learn about what they may be facing. Whatever the reason that you're joining us, our desire is that you find information, comfort, and hope.
So in our grief counseling practice at the Grief Support Program, we provide information like we are presenting today, as we know it can help people who are feeling distressed with their loss. We are presenting this as we know it can be more difficult to access support while people are in isolation or not connected to their social supports during this pandemic. Our world has changed and many people are experiencing losses of many kinds. For those who have lost a loved one die, this can be an exceptionally more difficult time, which we will talk about in this presentation. So before we begin, we want to go over some housekeeping items with you. As we go through this material, it might stir up some grief reactions that you might not expect. This is normal, so don't be surprised at how you're feeling. You might feel tired or drained after what we share today, but we also hope you come away with some hope and guidance in your grief. So if you came to the center, we'd be able to assess how you're doing. But because we cannot do that today, please be mindful of how you're feeling. This presentation will take about 40 minutes. So we encourage you to take a break at any time. Pause this presentation, walk around, get some water, and take some deep breaths. We recommend that you write down the Distress Center number now in case you need it at any time during this presentation, or your local crisis line where you are located. If you are in distress right now, we would prefer to talk to someone right away, call the Distress Center immediately. So today's discussion is going to involve defining what grief and loss is. We'll talk about ways, what gets in the way of our grief during a pandemic. We'll explore how to navigate grief during this time. And finally, we will talk about coping strategies and resources that you can access after listening to us today. We're going to weave in lessons from researchers, volunteers, and clients that are knowledgeable in the field of grief and loss.
So what do we know about loss? Loss is a universal human experience that every person repeatedly encounters. Losses have occurred in our lives since birth and are part of our human experience. Examples of loss include transitions, such as marriage, graduation, and retirement. While transitions can be seen as positive, they can include an element of loss as we leave the former behind and embark on the new. Loss is a necessary and natural part of existence. Loss is often connected to change in our lives. If you look back in the past, you may notice that change has been a constant. Loss can be physical or symbolic. For instance, physical losses can include a person, a cherished item, or a home. Symbolic losses could be a job, future plans, or the graduation events of those in grade 12 right now.
So as Katie mentioned, loss is a universal human experience, and we are certainly seeing this in our world today. So let's cover a bit about how loss looks during the time of a pandemic. Firstly, I'd like to start with the loss that we're all feeling, that loss of certainty and our assumptive world. Loss of our assumptive world means that we currently have lost the ability to assume that we know how our world will operate. How we see the world and expect things to be gives us a sense of predictability, consistency, and safety. For example, we might have always assumed we could go to the store and buy whatever we needed. Every time we go to a grocery store now, there is the question of, will I find what I need? Will I be safe while I'm shopping? What will I bring home with me? Questions we have never asked ourselves before can take us to a consistently heightened sense. On top of the loss of certainty, we've got many non-death losses happening at the same time. Many of you might be experiencing job loss, or a sense of financial security might be shaken. Many of you might have experienced the loss of freedom and social movement. We have experienced the loss of the ability to go places freely and to connect with others. This changes how our relationships are nurtured, how we relate to our family and friends. Sporting and arts events, ways we interact before, are no longer available to us right now. And finally, we have the loss of routines and gatherings. How schools operate has required students to adapt. Life stages such as anniversaries, graduations, birthdays, and other significant events have been severely curtailed, if not completely eliminated, without any notice or ability to recognize and acknowledge that end. Easter, Passover, and currently Ramadan were all impacted this year and resulted in a change in valued and revered traditions that go back centuries. So each of these losses will be interpreted differently by everyone, and we want to acknowledge that all these losses hold importance.
So what do we know about grief? Grief is our response to the loss of anything that we value, and it's a natural response to that loss. Some examples could include moving away from our family home, the changes that aging makes to our being, and specifically for this presentation, the death of someone dear to us. It is our expression of that loss and is a personal and unique process for each person. Only you had that relationship with the person who died. Your journey in the processing of your grief is your own and as individual as your fingerprints. Thus, your experience with grief is not open to comparison. Even if you and your sibling lost your parent, each of your relationships with that same parent is different. We will be sharing several tools for helping with the grief journey. Because everyone is different in their grieving style, we encourage you to take what fits and leave the rest. You know yourself best and what will help. When we begin to understand the grieving process, we find that the better you understand grief and how it's healed, the better equipped you'll be. First off, there's no right or wrong way to grieve. Your way of grieving is the ideal one for you. We do know that grief does not unfold in linear, predictable stages. Instead, it's more thought of as a spiral or a coil. You may go through orderly stages as your grief unfolds, but may find you revisit some of those stages later on. For instance, when my father died, I found myself feeling very angry for a time due to the circumstances. I moved through this anger during the days and weeks following his death. A few years later, that anger seemed to rise in me again. It would be a mistake to think that I had reverted back to the beginning of my grieving journey for him. Indeed, I was that much further along, but through the passage of time, I was processing different facets and repercussions of the loss. Thus, I was visiting anger again, but in a different light. Grief may also involve extreme emotions and behaviors. We hear most frequently of anger, despair, and fear, which are all common. Be assured that whatever you're feeling is normal. Allowing each feeling to surface and be expressed is helpful. There is no set or universal timetable for grieving. Try to avoid the pressure that can come from others to move on. Timetables for grief are hard to predict, as many factors determine how long it will take. Some of those factors can include your relationship, positive or negative, with the person who died, your previous loss history, meaning how many losses you've dealt with in your past, and what you were taught or not taught about grieving. Now, how grief shows up in our lives, you will come to see through the examples in each category, grief affects every part of our DNA. Physically, reduced energy that can feel like you are slogging through deep mud. Your sleep can be affected either due to sleeping too much or not enough, largely through not being able to fall asleep or stay asleep. You might experience chest pains or body aches. Grief could affect your appetite. Emotionally, anger and resentment can be present. It can be a surprise as to the intensity and where it's directed. You may find you're angry at God, the medical field, yourself, or even the person who died. You may have had a lot of sadness, fear, or heightened anxiety. Guilt can be present over many things, such as what was said or done, or not said or done. Guilt could also be due to whether you were present or not when your loved one died. Mentally, memory and concentration problems may be present for a time. You may be less motivated and more overwhelmed. Shock and denial can be experienced, which is a necessary concept. By that I mean they are the brain's way of anesthetizing you from the realization of your loved one's death until you are more mentally able to handle it. Shock and denial can occur for days, weeks, or months. Socially, a desire to isolate yourself is typical. In isolation, it means one doesn't have to appear as if you're okay when around others. Alternately, you can also feel the desire to be around safe people in your lives. One can feel disconnected and low functioning. Perhaps some roles have changed now that that person is gone. If mom has passed and she was the glue in our family, who will take on that role now? Spiritually, life has changed. Now what? There can be more or less involvement in a faith community. One's faith may grow as a result of the death and providing needed support. Or it could be a time to reevaluate what made sense before and discern what fits better now. There can be a loss of meaning and purpose. It's normal to choose to reframe our philosophy of life during times of loss. One widower described his life as a basket filled with stones. These stones represented different facets of his life. Some were put there by him, while others were added by other people. When his wife died, he said it felt as if the basket had been overturned, which caused all the stones to fall out. He began to realize that it was now up to him to decide which stones were to be put back in the basket that was his life, and which stones were no longer necessary. He also was open to adding new stones to his basket as time went on. Now that we know how grief affects us, what gets in the way of our grief? Well, for one thing, it could make others around us uncomfortable. Some people in our lives may avoid us and even avoid bringing up the topic of our loved one for fear of reminding us of the loss and making us sad. A wise father I worked with that had lost his son said, "You can't make me any sadder. Please mention my son's name. I love talking and hearing about him." Perceived pressure to get over it quickly. This can cause us to have to act recovered in order to be treated in an acceptable manner. This, in itself, can add even more exhaustion to our daily lives. I hear of this pressure most often from clients who have returned to their jobs. While some employers are understanding and supportive of loss, some are not. Coping with insensitive comments. While we don't recommend giving advice, I'm going to give you some right now anyway. Sometimes we hear sentences that begin with "at least." For instance, "at least your mother lived into her 80s," or "at least you had a good relationship with that person." Here's my advice. If you hear someone begin a sentence with the words "at least," stop listening. While we may realize it's with the best of intentions to provide us with perspective or gratitude, in the early days, weeks, and months of our grief and pain, it isn't helpful. These comments are much harder to hear in the depth of our pain and sadness. Lack of ritual. Some people request that there be no funeral or memorial service following their death. While it is understandable to want to honor their wishes, we at the Grief Support Program also encourage planning some way of gathering together with others who knew and loved them. It can be helpful and healing to reflect, honor, and share stories about the person who died. Though the current pandemic certainly causes this ritualistic step to be more difficult, there are still ways to connect with the person who died that Kim will be sharing a little later. Finally, wondering about the right way to grieve. The answer to this is your way. You know best what helps and what doesn't.
So in addition to what Katie mentioned, there are specific features that we see today that get in the way of our grief during a pandemic. So firstly, physically distancing creates a lack of social support for family and for a lack of touch, along with other losses that are happening concurrently. So this does not allow for that connection that we would normally get from our usual support network. Non-COVID-19 deaths may not get as much support. There continue to be deaths from heart attacks, cancer, accidents, and regardless of the pandemic, but these losses don't necessarily make the news. All losses are impacted by this virus, regardless of whether the death was by COVID-19 or not, but it might feel like your loss is overshadowed. If your loss is from non-COVID death, you may feel that the world is not acknowledging the significance of the loss while the world is focused on the pandemic. Nextly, there is a lack of supportive ritual at this time. As Katie mentioned in her piece, this is a very common piece when it comes to before the pandemic, that lack of ritual can really impede one's ability to grieve. But with either small or no funerals taking place right now, the support and innate human need for remembering in a public fashion is not available. Ellen Wolfelt, who has done a lot of work on grief, talks about mourning being the public expression of grief. There is not the ability to mourn in the ways right now that we would prefer. And lastly, there's the ability to celebrate your loved one's life, including saying any last words or saying goodbye. These moments aren't happening and cannot be realized. The pandemic means that people are more separated from their supports and may not have been able to be with their loved one at end of life. This can bring a strong feeling of anguish, and it might be very hard to know even what your loved one experienced as they died if you were unable to be with them. And being more isolated and on top of that can bring a stronger sense of loneliness with your loss. So all of these factors that Katie and I both mentioned can lead to your grief not being acknowledged or felt like you are heard, meaning that your grief is minimized. And this can be described in a term called disenfranchised grief. Dr. Kenneth Doka coined this term, and what it means is a loss that is not socially sanctioned, openly acknowledged, or publicly mourned. And while his research began out of a learning about grief that was felt for ex-spouses, the term really applies to today. So allowing your grief to be expressed, to have it named and acknowledged, is key to addressing this type of grief. One example of disenfranchised grief might be a loss of a pet, or it might be a loss of a nephew or a cousin. One of our clients talked about losing someone at an advanced age. When her 103-year-old grandfather died, she received many comments about how wonderful it was he lived such a long life and that she shouldn't be sad. This led to more intense feelings of disconnectedness because what she knew but didn't know how to express was that this was the man that had raised her, and she had lost a significant relationship in her life. How timely to hear this example today. Naming and acknowledging the importance to her regardless of age helps support her through her grief. So this quote is from Earl Groman. Grief is not a disorder, a disease, or sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity, the price you pay for love. The only cure for grief is to grieve. But we get asked, how do you do that? How do I know I'm grieving right? Give me the magic pill. Tell me what I need to do to speed this up and get the pain over with. As Katie mentioned earlier, grief is not linear. And so we want to share with you another approach that can provide a roadmap. We cannot take the pain away, but what we can do is give you some structure on how to manage grief. Don't forget that everyone will grieve differently, and what works for you may not work for someone else. So this model is called the dual process model of coping with bereavement, and it was created by two Dutch researchers named Strobe and Schutt. So instead of being a straight line, you'll see that it's a balance or an oscillation back and forth between two experiences. On the left-hand side, you'll see what we call loss orientation. The focus is on processing different aspects of the loss. This is what we as a society would typically think that grief looks like. There might be a lot of tears. There's reflection and talking about the loss. Loss orientation can involve revisiting the death story, reflecting on those last moments, days, even weeks. It can involve exploring the relationship with the deceased, Relationships are complex, and we might reflect on what that relationship meant to us. It can also involve intense emotions and struggling with the why this happened to me. But healthy grieving doesn't end there. When we look to the right side, we see what we call restoration orientation. And this is the learning that we do to reorient ourselves in the world. This involves attending to life changes, doing new things, being distracted, or even avoiding your grief. If you're early in your grief, you might look at this and find it hard to consider how you might try new things on the restoration side or take on new roles and identities, and we hear you. This is okay to feel this way. Think instead of how might you focus on the distraction part of this model. Because if you were to spend 24 hours, 7 days a week on the loss orientation side, this would be emotionally and physically exhausting, as many of you have probably already discovered. What this model does is it will give you the permission to know that for healthy grieving to occur, you need to oscillate between both sides. What can you do to distract yourself and step away from your grief right now so that you can come back to the work of grieving on the loss side? What can you do to nurture and care for yourself so that you can continue running this marathon we call grief? Taking care of yourselves is a part of the grieving process. So, and even particularly during this time, you might even find the need to set aside your grief for now due to the stresses and demands on you from all of the other losses that you are dealing with. This is also okay. Katie, do you have anything else that you want to add to this?
Yes, Kim, I do. Thank you. On the loss-oriented side, there are those who wish time would stop. It's hard for them to see the world continuing and people getting on with their lives, while the person who is grieving is clinging to the one they miss. That aching and desperation is inherent in the loss-oriented side. Now, when it comes to what to do about this, we have a concept called self-care. As grief affects every part of our DNA, our tank of reserves can run pretty close to empty. We may not know how to replenish our supply of energy. Luckily, there is a way. It's referred to as self-care. Self-care is care provided for you by you. It's about identifying your own needs and taking steps to meet them. It's taking the time to do some of the activities that nurture you. Self-care is about taking proper care of yourself and treating yourself as kindly as you treat others.
When you hear the idea of self-care, you may be tempted to think you're either too busy or that others have it worse than you. You don't deserve to take time for yourself, and that might be true. But we want to emphasize that no one is exempt from needing self-care. So you'll see on this list, there are those of you that are essential workers, nurses, doctors, allied health, grocery store workers. There are those of you that might be self-isolating, that you're required to be at home. There might be those of you that are finding life quiet and alone. Maybe you're retired, unable to see your grandchildren or your children. There might be those of you out there that are juggling working from home and childcare and feel like you have no time in your day. The important thing is that all of you, regardless of where you're at right now during this time, we all need to practice self-care.
So what can I do to help myself right now, especially during this pandemic? Well, physically, drinking lots of water, eating healthily, breathing deeply, and getting lots of rest can help, especially getting outside daily for some fresh air. Even if it's just 5 minutes 3 times a day, it can make a difference. Emotionally, finding outlets for your feelings like talking, journaling, playing music. When you're seeking connection to your loved one, playing their favorite music can help. With the many genres available, music can reflect and enhance our moods. Socially, connect with family and friends via phone or video chat. Let others know what you need from them and how best to support you. Don't expect that they will know. As the weather gets better and being outside becomes more pleasant, setting your lawn chairs at least 6 feet apart can enable you to have a face-to-face visit. As friends come forward to express their desire to help, provide them with opportunities to do so. Limit media exposure. It can be overwhelming right now to attempt to be on top of all the latest news. Guard your time and your timing. News right before bedtime can interfere with sleep. And finally, spiritual. Meditate, pray, create, and practice rituals that connected to your loss. Attend religious services virtually. Humor can lift our spirits. Don't discount how much humor can help. Now's the time to get in touch with those people who lift your spirits. There are YouTube videos and television shows to amuse you. Just as crying is a release, so is laughing.
And just as we need permission to be on that restoration side, humor can really do this for us as well.
Yes.
So specifically when it comes to self-care on helping yourself through grief during this time, firstly, we want to acknowledge your losses and name them in order to validate how you're feeling. Others might not do this for you, so address your disenfranchised grief in your way. Create your own ritual. As Katie mentioned earlier about what gets in the way of our grief, this could be a lack of ritual. And it will look different than how you might want it right now. But think on what are rituals that you can do at home today that allow you to remember and acknowledge your loss. It might be as simple as lighting a candle, baking a favorite food of your loved one, or doing something at home that allows you to feel connected to them. Use your own creativity and the unique relationship that you had to come up with your own ideas. With many of our clients, there can feel like there is unfinished business. Either there was no funeral or the funeral didn't turn out as they had wanted. This was very common even before the pandemic. And this also more than not applies today. There will be a time down the road when you will be able to create a ritual or celebration that feels more representative of how best to honor your loved one. Consider it a do-over. It is never too late to create this. Ken Doka, who coined disenfranchised grief, notes that funerals can have a positive impact on grief, so be open to planning something in the future. And lastly, we can grieve later. It is normal to set aside grief to survive. If that is what best serves you in your self-care, feel free to do so. And in the interim, when it comes to self-care, what can you do now that will allow you to feel some sense of control? This graph by thecounselingteacher.com has been going around social media and really is a lovely way of capturing how you have control over more than you realize. Grief can feel like a state where you don't have a lot of control and it controls you. And so here are some examples of what you can control. I encourage you to look at this on your own time. And sometimes we can start to live too much in the future, which reminds us of what we can't know or anticipate at this time, and that can create feelings of anxiousness. This slide gives us some ideas on how to focus on the here and now, becoming more present in the present day. So our bodies are very reactive to stress around us, and we are not in control of the ways our body reacts to stress. But some things can help. Imagining a calm place, going back to a time where you felt safe. It can be imaginary, it can be a real place. Reflecting on the senses, how does it make you feel? Do you feel quiet? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you taste? Imagining that calm place that can take you to a place of safety. Progressive muscle relaxation, either relaxing either part of the body or clenching and releasing muscles in the body. I encourage you to Google that if that is something that you're interested in trying. Soothing breathing, breathe in for 4 seconds, hold, and breathe out for 4 seconds. Continue to do this for 30 seconds several times a day. It may seem simple, but it can make a huge difference. Meditation and calming apps, many people have found these helpful, and you're welcome also to search these up at your own time. And lastly, a butterfly hug. Butterfly hug is a simple technique that anyone can do to help self-soothe. Going back to that calm place that you've created for yourself and taking a moment while doing so, as you can see in the photo, a butterfly hug while closing your eyes. What images, colors, sounds, and scents do you observe in your safe place? And finally, I want to leave you with some hope. Alan Wolfelt, who I mentioned earlier, wrote an article on nurturing yourself during this time. If you were to read up on anyone's work on grief, I'd suggest checking him out. He mentioned 3 things that we can do now: practice mindfulness, be aware of what we can't control, and finally, consciously choosing hope. Hope is what gives us a reason to keep moving and looking ahead. I just love this quote and felt it needed to be said in its entirety, so I'm going to read it for you now. Consciously choosing hope, the pillar that holds up the world. Our culture usually isn't so good at honoring loss and supporting those who are grieving, even though they are essential parts of our lives. Instead, to our detriment, we tend to focus almost exclusively on the happy and the distracting and the fun. But it's a question of balance. We need both, you see. We need to honor the light and the dark, the happy and the sad, and everything in between, because all of it belongs. All of it is authentic. And whatever is authentic is normal and necessary. Usually we're out of balance because we choose to shine our awareness only on the good stuff. But right now, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, we're at risk for the balance tipping too far the other way, in the direction of fear and despair. Yes, in difficult times, we must remember to hope. So we'd like to leave you with some resources that you can access online to help specifically with processing your grief. 2 Canadian content websites, mygrief.ca and virtualhospice.ca, have practical tools. They have videos of others with lived experience and loss that you can go and connect with and learn more about the grief journey. When it comes to journaling or doing work online with writing, 2 resources there: aftertalk.com. Robert Niemeyer has done some work on meaning making and continuing those bonds with your loved one. I encourage you to check that out. Megan Devine has her website, refugeingrief.com, a very intentional approach on journaling, exploring your grief at the same time. Alan Wolfelt's site, which we mentioned before, centerforloss.com. For those of you that have children under the age of 18 that are grieving and are curious about how to help assist them, and you're in the Calgary area, hospicecalgary.ca/Children's Grief Center is the place that we recommend you check out for helping children that are grieving. And finally, as anxiety is definitely a feature that we are seeing a lot nowadays, we recommend the website anxietycanada.com if you're looking for more resources and guidance on how to help you through anxiety. Lastly, if you are in crisis, we provided some other numbers for support. These are all local within the Calgary area. We encourage you to seek out local crisis supports in your area if you need to talk to someone immediately. And here in Calgary, you'll see at the bottom is our phone number. We have the Grief Support Program who supports people 18 plus who have had someone in their life die. We encourage you to contact us if you would like to speak to a counselor to get support with your bereavement, and if you live in the Calgary zone. We're providing support for those who live in the Calgary zone by phone. If you live elsewhere, we encourage you to reach out for help in your local area if you're feeling the need to talk to someone about your grief.
And finally, thank you for taking this time to watch this presentation. We hope that by taking this healing step, you've been provided with help and support. Feel free to share this presentation with others. Don't hesitate to reach out for more support if needed. Finally, we end with a quote from Helen Keller. What we have once enjoyed and deeply loved, we can never lose. For all that we love deeply becomes part of us. We wish you all the best.